Hi guys, Trevor Sullivan here and welcome back to my channel. Now, if this is your first time on my channel, I talk a lot about different technologies like AWS or PowerShell and several other technologies as well. And so go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you would like to get notified about new videos on my channel. And if you click the bell icon, that will help ensure that you get the notification on your phone anytime that there is new content published to this channel. I don't know how YouTube does their algorithm thingy where they choose which videos to notify about or not, but if you click that bell icon, it really does help you to get more immediate notifications. Now, moving on, we are actually wearing an Azure t-shirt today, and we're going to be talking about a really cool new AWS feature. Not Azure, I'm just wearing the Azure t-shirt for representation because, you know, cloud is cool in general. We're not going to discriminate here. And this new feature is called AWS CloudShell, as indicated right about here. And AWS CloudShell is basically a mechanism that gives you an interactive shell environment to manage your AWS resources so that you don't have to worry about setting up a shell environment yourself, either on your development workstation or workstations, plural. And you also don't have to worry about setting something up in the cloud. Now, me personally, I use a lot of AWS CLI tools locally. I'm a pretty heavy user of the AWS Powershell module itself, not so big on the AWS CLI just because it doesn't have the same level of IntelliSense that the PowerShell module has, and I kind of like the verbosity of PowerShell. I've just been using PowerShell for a long time, so that's kind of where I'm at. But what I wanted to do is just kind of go over this new feature with you and take a look at some of the capabilities it has, the default environment, and some of the customizations you can apply as well. So let's jump over here into our web browser here. Now, if you are just using AWS Cloud Shell for the first time, when you fire up the AWS Management Console, there's another new feature. Believe it or not, back when I worked at Amazon, I actually wrote the paper that originally proposed this idea. But up here at the top, you've got this unified search bar is what they're calling it. It's another new feature, and there's actually a nice keyboard shortcut, Alt-S. So if you hit Alt-S, that'll just navigate you over to that unified search shortcut. And basically what this is it allows you to search for different services, documentation, AWS Marketplace products, and things like that. Now, back when I worked at AWS, I had actually proposed that this feature should allow you to search across all of your AWS resources, regardless of which AWS account or region they exist in. And you might be like, whoa, Trevor, you know, that's really ambitious because, you know, how are you supposed to inventory all these resources from different accounts and everything? Well, as you probably know, there's been some AWS services that have come out over the last several years that have really aided in cross-account and cross-region resource management. And a couple of those services are, number one, AWS Organizations, which allows you to basically create a hierarchy of AWS accounts so that you could have a separate, dev account, separate production account. You could have separate dev, test, and production accounts for different application teams within your company and things like that. But there's also the AWS Config service, and AWS Config actually part of it is config management for your AWS resources and compliance enforcement, but part of it is also about inventorying the AWS resources that you have in your account as well. So AWS Config actually has a lot of that inventory data already available that you can query regardless of what region you're in, so that you don't have to hit all the different list and describe APIs out there to get a list of all my EC2 instances, and then for each of those EC2 instances, describe all the metadata for them. A lot of that information is actually stored in AWS Config. So I'm excited that they've kind of partially implemented AWS Unified Search, but in terms of what I kind of envisioned it being back several years ago when I worked at Amazon, it doesn't really meet up with my kind of personal expectations for what that could be. I'm sure that eventually they'll come out with that capability in the future, but hey, we'll see. In any case, if you hit Alt-S and head up there and just search for Cloud Shell, this is how you can fire up the Cloud Shell environment. And honestly, it's kind of cool, but I guess I would have expected a little bit more from this environment, because basically all it is a shell environment that inherits the AWS credentials that you're currently logged in with, And it provides some pre-installed command line tools so that you can manage your AWS resources. So as it indicates here in the help, it's like, hey, you can run the AWS CLI, so AWS -- version. Sure enough, that works okay. We've got AWS CLI v2 here. And they also, in the documentation for it, indicate that other tools like PowerShell are pre-installed, which is my personal preference for interacting with pretty much any API versus just a CLI tool. PowerShell has a lot of introspection capabilities that other command line tools don't necessarily have, or they have to expend extra effort in order to implement those. And in PowerShell, you get a lot of that kind of auto-completion stuff for free, so to speak, just because it's a very introspective system. So PowerShell is pretty cool. It's also got VI pre-installed. Okay, wow, cool. It has Git pre-installed. Okay, great. It has NPM and pip package managers for Node.js and Python. Okay, I guess that's fine, whatever. But yeah, it just has a few pre-installed tools. There's no additional charge for it, so I guess that's a convenience. But yeah, it gives you a gigabyte of storage space, which I guess is useful if you have some, setup scripts that you want to run during initialization time or something like that, just to kind of set up your Cloud Shell environment. I'm not sure, honestly, how long the Cloud Shell environment sticks around. I know I spun it up earlier, and by the time I came back and actually went to start building a video around it, it had expired, and so it was, so I had to rebuild that session. One of the things that I noticed is that the initialization time, I'm just approximating, it's probably somewhere around 20 to 30 seconds, something like that. So it's not super fast. It's not like, just fire up, Windows terminal here, open up a new PowerShell session, and in a couple seconds, I am good to go. I can start running, PowerShell commands and things like that. Well, I could if my module was imported. But yeah, I'm not super keen on the initialization time. I guess one of the convenient things is that it does run in your web browser. So as long as you have a web browser, if you're using a low power device like a Chromebook or something like that, I guess it could be convenient to have some of these tools available. Just in general, I just kind of prefer to kind of configure my own environment because I know what needs to go in there. Now, one of the first things that I did when I fired up Cloud Shell is I tried to fire up PowerShell. And this was before I even knew if PowerShell was going to be available in the environment. I was pleasantly surprised that they actually had enough foresight to include PowerShell. But as soon as I fired up PowerShell, there's something that I noticed. In fact, I didn't even look at this banner here indicating that there's an update available because I know, of course, being on my local system here, that PowerShell 7.1.0 is the most recent version. And it's actually been around for a little while. There's actually a 7.2.0 preview number 2 available. So there's preview 1 and preview 2. So yeah, I mean, 7.1.0 is certainly not brand new. And considering that they just launched this feature on December 15th, kind of would have expected them to come out with, PowerShell version 7.1 pre-installed. No big deal, I guess. At least it's PowerShell core. By the way, for those of you who are maybe new to this, PowerShell is actually a cross-platform automation framework. It's been open source and cross-platform for the last 4+ years. I think it was August of 2016 that it originally got open sourced. I've actually got a video out there on MSDN Channel 9 that talked about that on launch day back in 2016. But yeah, PowerShell does work cross-platform now. Yes, it is a Microsoft open source tool. However, it is incredibly powerful compared to the traditional text-based shell like Bash. So definitely encourage you to check it out and at least be open to the idea of an object-oriented shell. It's really cool. So moving right along, we do have 1 GB of storage inside of our home directory here, which is something to point out. What I did want to point out on this PowerShell version, though, is that you can actually upgrade it. So if you just Google for how to install PowerShell, it'll take you out to the PowerShell install docs. You can look at installing PowerShell on Linux, and it does support a variety of different operating systems, such as Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, one of the first things I did is I kind of assumed that this was going to be an environment based on Amazon Linux 2, which uses Yum as the package manager. And so I ran Yum just to see if that was available, and sure enough, it was. And when I did Yum list and piped it into less, of course, I have to run it with sudo permissions. Actually, it looks like it's going to run okay without it regardless. If I just tab down here, and look for PowerShell. There it is, PowerShell version 7.0.3, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7. So that is the version we're running. And then if we do uname-a, sure enough, you can see, let me clear my console here. You can see we're running on Amazon Linux 2 as indicated right here, AMZN2 x86 64. So given that I knew it was Amazon Linux 2 environment, it's apparently based on Red Hat Enterprise Linux, I know that I can go out to the releases page for PowerShell. So if you go to github.com/PowerShell/PowerShell, go to the releases tab, which, by the way, if you don't know where that is, it's over here on the right-hand side. Just click on releases, and then we'll grab the latest production release, which is 7.10 right here. And then there is a list of files for different operating systems that are supported here. So up here at the top, we've got a link to Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7, x86 64. So we'll just copy the link to that. And then what we can do is just curl this file, or actually I'm going to do invoke web request because that's the PowerShell way of doing things, -URI, and then I'll paste in the link there, and then -out file parameter. We'll just call it posh.rpm. So this file is about 66 megs, I think. Yeah, about 67 megabytes it looks like. And so I'm just going to do a yum install pwsh.rpm. Of course, we have to sudo. So I'll run that. Total size 170 meg. And PowerShell 7.1 installs pretty easily. If you do $ps version table, you can see we're on 703. If I exit, run posh again, now we are successfully running PowerShell 7.1.0. So we're good to go there. Now, one thing that I think I noticed, I'm just going to double check here, is, yeah, so if we do a get module list available for AWS, we don't actually have the AWS PowerShell modules installed in the CloudShell environment by default. And I was kind of surprised by that because they installed the AWS CLI, they installed Node.js, they install Python, they install PowerShell. So we've got all these runtimes available, but we don't actually have the PowerShell module for AWS, which is a pretty well-known tool. It's very powerful. In fact, I contributed some improvements to it back when I worked at AWS, and that doesn't seem to be installed. So you'd actually have to do a install module, -scope current user, -name AWS PowerShell.NET Core, -force, and that should get us the module installed here. Now, there are a couple of different versions of the AWS PowerShell module. There's the kind of monolithic version that has the commands from all of the different services, and then there's actually a modular version that actually has the individual services broken down into separate modules. And there's a very specific reason that they do that, for performance reasons, but for convenience, you can just certainly install the monolithic module here. So now if we do get module list available AWS star, now we do have this module installed. So just be aware that the AWS PowerShell module is not available by default in the CloudShell environment. So in your initialization script, in that 1 GB of storage that you get with AWS CloudShell, you certainly could have a script that, as part of the initialization process, you could just run that at startup and say, okay, install the PowerShell module for AWS, install the latest version of the PowerShell runtime, things like that. It's kind of up to you what you want to do, but just be aware that you do have to install that explicitly. One other thing I wanted to point out as well is that AWS CloudShell does not currently have access to VPC. In fact, if you go to the FAQ for it, just do a Control F in your browser and search for VPC, you'll notice that it does not currently offer VPC access. So if you do need private API access to certain resources, that will not be available inside of the CloudShell environment. Now, CloudShell does have some settings on it. If you click this little gear icon up here in the top right corner, There's just some really basic settings here. So by default on my system, it was using the dark theme. It does also have a light theme as well, depending on what your preferences are. To be honest, some of the colors are a little bizarre. This yellow on top of this white background is kind of hard to read. Same thing with this light gray here that we have. A little bit hard to read, so I think they could do a little bit better in the future with some additional customization options for the theme. But you know, I'm kind of nitpicking at this point. We also have a font size option here, but I did notice that actually if you just do Control Scroll, just use your web browser's Control plus or minus feature to improve the zoom size, that seems to work pretty well on its own as well. So I don't necessarily see a need for them to include a font size setting, considering that I can just use my browser to zoom in and out, but to each their own. And then up here under Actions, we have the ability to create a new tab. So you might have noticed there's this tab-based interface, and so we can create more than one tab. We can also split into rows, so we can split into columns as well. And we can kind of have this it's almost kind of like a TMUX style interface, or maybe like a Windows terminal type of interface where we can use some keyboard shortcuts to kind of split up our environment into different windows here. Or if you're coming from Linux, TMUX is probably a little bit more native to you. But yeah, I mean, they're trying to kind of emulate some of the functionality that you would see in a local shell, but doing it inside of a web browser. And then if you need to, you can also force restart the Cloud Shell environment. So I can just go ahead and force that here. And then they also provided an option to either download files that you've uploaded to the Cloud Shell environment, or you can upload files from your local system up into that Cloud Shell environment as well. Now, personally, I think Cloud Shell's kind of a convenience mechanism, but it's just that. In general, if you needed kind of a cloud-based shell environment, I would probably recommend using a Bastion host running on EC2, like a T3 micro instance or something like that. The other option as well is to spin up an AWS Fargate container that contains the compute resources that you need as well. It's more customizable. You can pre-configure a Docker container in AWS Fargate that has all the software that you need kind of pre-packaged up into it. You don't have to worry about running any special initialization scripts that are specific to your environment and things like that. So, that would be my general personal preference, or just using shell tools locally on my system as well. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out kind of before we close out is that the AWS Cloud Shell we head over to the FAQs here. I believe it has a single vCPU in it. Let me actually just go back a little bit here. Yeah, so under AWS Cloud Shell compute environment, they do document exactly the compute resources that they're allocating to you. So you get a single vCPU and you get 2 GB of RAM. So you're kind of stuck with that. There's no customization options as far as I know right now, but it does have a single vCPU, 2 gigs of RAM. Of course, if you're running something like AWS Fargate, you can allocate as much or as few resources as you specifically need. Plus, you have the benefit of being able to configure your entire dev environment in a container using your tools of choice. So overall, I mean, I think Cloud Shell is kind of a cool idea. I probably will not personally end up using it all that often, but for the average AWS user who may not be super adept with the platform and knows how to do all the kind of dev tool setup, I could see how somebody might find this convenient. I guess one other thing I wanted to point out as well is that if you're working in a shell environment and you type a long command and you're like, oh, I want to erase this and start fresh. If I hit Control W, oh no, my browser window's gone, because Control W was intercepted by the browser, not by the actual application running in the browser. So perhaps they could override the default behavior of the browser, prevent the default behavior from occurring, and then implement Control W in their own way. I'm not sure if the browser actually supports that or not. I'd have to test it out, but yeah, it's not going to work exactly like a shell environment like what you'd expect to. So just be aware of that as well. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoy AWS Cloud Shell, and I hope you take the opportunity to learn about PowerShell if you have not already. You can follow me over on Twitter at twitter.com/PCGeek86, and you can head over to cbtnuggets.com And I offer a bunch of different training materials over at cbtnuggets.com. If you are not sure if you're interested in signing up for a subscription to CBT Nuggets, we actually do offer a free account perpetually for CBT Nuggets learners. So if you just search for CBT Nuggets free, head over to free IT training. You can actually sign up for free with a Google account and watch a lot of free training content from our excellent instructors on things like AWS, things like Python programming, things like PowerShell development, networking concepts, security, and a whole lot of other interesting topics. So definitely encourage you to head over to cbtnuggets.com, sign up for a free learner account, and consider signing up for a subscription if you like what you see. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.